Hi everyone, I'm Gertie and I am so excited to introduce to you our latest charm pattern design, which is called the Rosie Jumpsuit. This is a jumpsuit inspired by World War II era workwear, and of course the name was inspired by Rosie the Riveter herself. I love to wear jumpsuits in my everyday life because they're so comfortable, so easy, and also you can style them very vintage or a little more modern. I designed this jumpsuit to have a lot of utilitarian workwear details. So it has a collar and a zip front, so you're going to learn how to sew a front fly today. It also has adjustable tabs at the waistline, so you can wear it a little more cinched or on the looser side. And then, of course, a ton of pockets because I know how much you all love pockets. And as always, with every charm pattern, we like to give you a lot of different variations for how you can sew the pattern. So it has two pant length options. There's a full length pant with a cuff. There's also a shorts version, so you can make an adorable Playsuit. And then we've given you three sleeve options. So there's a long sleeve with a placket and a cuff, a short puff sleeve with a cuff, and then finally you can also make this sleeveless. So I hope you love learning how to sew the Rosie jumpsuit today. Let's go ahead and get started talking about the pattern pieces and then fabric and supplies. Okay, so now we're going to go over the pattern pieces for the Rosie jumpsuit. So there are a lot of them, so we're just going to take this one piece at a time. Keep in mind that the reason there are so many pieces is, well, first of all, you have some different design options for this pattern, but also because the right front and left front are asymmetrical because of the overlap and underlap for the zipper, that means you have double the pieces that you would normally have for just the front of the jumpsuit. So keep that in mind. And as you're cutting, make sure that you're keeping your pattern pieces pinned to your fabric so that you know which is the right and which is the left as you're going. Okay, so let's get started going through these pieces. These are minimized down to 25% so that we can see them all together. And they're laid out kind of how they go together. Here are the front pieces, the back pieces, and then sleeves over here. Okay, so just to start, you have your collar. You're going to cut 2 fabric and 1 interfacing. And then here is your right front. And that's the side that overlaps, by the way. And then the left front is the underlap where the zipper is hidden. And you also have pockets for both the left front and the right front. So one side has a patch pocket, just a really simple patch pocket, and the other side has a little zippered pocket. So it has 2 pieces because you need a seam where the zipper is inserted. Okay, now let's go down to the facings. You have a separate right front facing and a separate left front facing for your jumpsuit. And so you're going to cut 1 fabric and 1 interfacing for each of those facing pieces. You also have a right front waistband and a left front waistband. Again, 1 fabric, 1 interfacing for both of those. We also have 1 single pattern piece for the front waistband lining, and you're going to cut 2 fabric for that. Now let's look at the pant pieces for the front. You have a right front pant and a left front pant. And you can see that one side has the fly extension, so make sure to cut that out carefully. And then you have separate cutting lines for the shorts right here. And then also keep in mind that this jumpsuit has a cuffed hem, so you're going to have an extension at the bottom where the cuff gets turned up. There are front pockets, of course, on your jumpsuit, and these are applied just like this, right on top of your pant front. So you're going to cut 2 of these. Now let's go to the back pieces. You have your back yoke, which you're going to cut 2 fabric on the fold. That's because that is self-lined, so you need 2 of those. And then you have your lower back bodice. This has gathers and gets seamed into the yoke, so be mindful of that circle right there. That is your gathering circle. The front pieces also have gathers, by the way, so you're also going to want to make sure to mark those circles on the front waistline on both the right front and the left front. Okay, continuing on the back. So then we also have the back waistband and lining. You're going to cut 2 fabric on the fold and 1 interfacing on the fold. And then you have your pant back. So you're going to cut 2 fabric on this. There's a patch pocket on both sides. That's this one right here. So you're going to cut 2 fabric on those. You also have a waist tab to make this adjustable to slightly cinch in the waist if you like. So you're gonna need to cut 4 of the waist tab and 2 interfacing. Now let's talk about sleeves. So you have the long sleeve option, which you would cut 2 fabric. You're going to need to cut 2 of the placket as well to finish that slit right there on the long sleeve. The placket does need to be cut on the bias, so be mindful of the grain line when you're cutting that. And then we have a long sleeve cuff. So you would cut 4 fabric and 2 interfacing for that piece. Okay, let's go to the short sleeve, which has gathers at the cap and where it meets the cuff. You're gonna cut 2 of the short sleeve, and then for the short sleeve cuff, cut 2 fabric and 2 interfacing. And then finally, last but not least, you have the option to make this jumpsuit sleeveless. So do keep in mind that there's a separate cutting line for the sleeveless version on the bodice pieces. So make sure to follow that if you're going to do the sleeveless version. And then you're going to need this armhole bias facing to finish your sleeveless version. So you would cut 2 of this and make sure to cut that on the bias. So that is all of your pattern pieces for the Rosie jumpsuit. Next, we're going to be talking about fabric and supplies. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the fabric and supplies that you need for your Rosie jumpsuit. So fabric first, we recommend only wovens for this project. You're not going to want to use knits for the Rosie jumpsuit. This hot pink is an Essex linen and cotton blend. It has a little bit more body to it, but it's going to wash up really nicely. So another note is that you're going to want to wash your fabric first before you sew with it, especially if that's how you plan to care for your jumpsuit in the end. And then this one has a little more drape to it. This is the Brussels washer linen, which I really love. It's a linen rayon blend, has a little more drape to it. Also, you might want to look into Tencel or lyocell gabardines or twills. These are much more drapey. So if you look at this one I got from Mood, has a lot of drape to it, has a little bit of sheen to it and a twill weave. This would give you a flowier jumpsuit and maybe it would tend to look a little bit dressier too, less workwear. Here is another Tencel blend. This one's blended with cotton and it's a gabardine weave, which would be perfect if you want to go for that sort of workwear look. And then finally, I mean, almost all cottons are going to be great for this project. This is an Oxford shirting, a little more lightweight, especially for the Playsuit, for the shorts version. If you want to do something a little bit lighter, this would be really great. Okay, so those are just a few examples, but as always, look to the instructions for more recommendations. You're also going to need some fusible interfacing for this project. We use this lightweight woven interfacing. We also recommend weft fusible interfacing for this jumpsuit. Okay, so let's talk about zippers. So you have 2 zippers on the Rosie jumpsuit. You have your front zipper, which for our samples, we bought 16 to 18 inch long metal zippers. You'll want to look to the instructions to see the exact length that you'll need for your size. And then you can either cut down to size if you need to, or you can also make it a little shorter by just placing it a little bit lower. All right, so that's another possibility. You'll also want a 5-inch zipper for that breast pocket that opens with a zipper. Okay, so next let's talk about buttons. You will want 4 5/8 of an inch buttons for your waistband. That's for those tabs in the back that make the waistband adjustable. You'll also need 2 1/2-inch buttons for the long sleeve version for the cuff. And these are both optional, but I did want to mention it. For the top of the zipper, you may want a small snap to close the fly so that it doesn't pop open at where the zipper opens to the neckline. And then another optional closure would be at the waistband where it overlaps. You may want a hook and bar just to keep it nice and secure and to keep it from popping open at all. But those are optional, and I think you should probably just make a version and see if you feel like you need them, and then you can always add it later. All right, so finally, thread. You will want all-purpose polyester thread for this project. And then a marking pen, I did just want to mention because there are some marks that you're going to need to see on the right side of your fabric. A great example would be the J-curve stitching line for the fly. You're going to want to mark that on the right side because you're going to need to follow that very closely. So you'll want to make sure that you have something that shows up well, but also that will disappear or that you can easily wash or brush off of your fabric. So in the studio, we like to use these disappearing ink pens because they show up really strongly and they also disappear after a day or so. But do test whatever you're going to use on your fabric just to make sure that you're happy with it. Okay, so that is all of your fabric and supplies for the Rosie jumpsuit. Okay, so we're going to start with the right breast pocket. You are seeing the lovely Kristen's hands today. She is a Team Charm member and she is going to be doing the sewing for us. So thank you, Kristen. So the first thing that she is doing is that she is applying a strip of fusible interfacing to the top of the pocket, folding down and pressing in the upper seam allowance 5/8 of an inch. And that's just to stabilize the upper edge and keep it from stretching out over time. And now you are going to stitch at 1/2 inch, top stitching the upper edge of the pocket down. So essentially hemming the upper edge of the pocket. And now we're going to turn in the remaining 3 edges of the pocket. You're going to turn it in 5/8 of an inch on all 3 sides and press. And you can use a gridded ruler to help you as you go. Be careful not to melt it, I will say that. They do make some pressing tools that are heat resistant, so you may want to look into those if you're worried about pressing, but you like this idea of being able to turn up your hem over a pressing guide. Okay, now we're going to place our pocket on the right side of the right bodice front. So you want to make sure that you have your circles marked on the right side, and of course use something that will wash out or brush off later. So invisible marking pen or a chalk that will brush off easily. And then match each corner of the pocket with one of those circles. And pin in place. And another handy tip is you can use your ruler behind something that you're pinning just so that you don't accidentally pin into your surface if you're pinning on an ironing board or something like that. And once it's pinned in place, then you're ready to top stitch the pocket, or technically edge stitch, since we are stitching real close to the edge here. Now the first thing that Kristen is going to do is stitch these little triangles at the top of the pocket for extra security. So just stitch at an angle across, and then a little bit across the upper edge, and then continue down one side and pivot at each corner. So that's one way that you can secure the upper edges of your pocket where they get a lot of wear. You can also do a bar tack there if you prefer. But these little triangles look really great. They're really common on workwear, so they fit really perfectly with this jumpsuit. And there's your right breast pocket. Okay, so now we're going to do the left breast pocket, and this one has a cool feature of a vertical zipper in it, which is a design detail that I borrowed from workwear and ready-to-wear jumpsuits that I've seen. So if this seems too fussy to you or you don't feel like inserting another zipper, you can always just do another patch pocket on this side. But I really love this detail. So you have 2 pieces for the zipper because there's a seam vertically for the zipper to be inserted in. So what we're doing here is first applying that fusible interfacing, the strips, to the zipper opening, and then turning in the seam allowances 5/8 of an inch. And now you're going to grab your 5-inch zipper, and metal zippers look really great here. So what we're going to do is we're going to place each side of the pocket with that turned in seam allowance over the zipper, centering the zipper in the middle. And you want the fold of the fabric, the one you just pressed in, to be just next to the zipper teeth, not covering them, but just next to them so that the zipper teeth are exposed. And then you are going to use a zipper foot and stitch next to the fold as close as you can. All the way down to the bottom of the zipper tape. Okay, so there's one side completed. And now we're going to take the bigger side of the pocket, the right side as you're looking at it, and do the same exact thing. Just place it right over the zipper tape and pin, and then stitch next to the fold. And you can kind of get it started and then stop with your needle down and pull the zipper pull out of the way because it's so bulky. And that is your inserted zipper. And now we're going to sew this pocket to the jumpsuit. You need to turn in all 4 edges of the pocket 5/8 of an inch and press them in. And now, just like we did with the other side, you're going to grab your bodice left front. Make sure you have those circles for the placement marked in, and then match each corner of the pocket to one of your circles and pin in place. And now we're ready to stitch it on. So again, this is an edge stitch. So right next to the edge, about 1/8 of an inch away from the fold of the pocket, you're going to stitch around all 4 sides. And just be careful not to hit anything metal, of course. Open the zipper if needed to get the pull out of the way. And pivot at each corner. And there's your finished pocket. You might want to just give this a press if you see any rippling around where you've stitched it on. Just give it a final press and it will look beautiful. Okay, so now we're going to do the gathering at the waist on both bodice fronts. And this gathering gives the jumpsuit a really feminine 40s look. So the right side we've already gathered, and now we're going to gather the left side between the circles. So set your machine to a longer stitch length, 4.5 to 5 millimeters is good. And make sure you have some tails on your thread, a couple inches. You're gonna do one line of stitching at 1/2 inch between the circles and the next one at 1/4 inch. So you have 2 lines of gathering stitches right next to each other, 1/4 inch apart within the seam allowance. So leave yourself those long tails on both ends of your stitching, and then you're going to pull up the bobbin threads. So whichever side was on the bottom, when you stitched your gathering stitches, you're going to pull it. And just create a slight gather for now. You will adjust those gathers later when you sew these pieces to the waistband, and you know exactly how many gathers you need, the density of the gathers. And there you go. That is your gathering. Now we're going to repeat the gathering process on the bodice back. The bodice back has gathers on both the upper and lower edge. The upper edge of the bodice back gets attached to the yoke, and it has gathers there, and there are also gathers at the waist. So you're going to repeat that same process of 2 rows of gathering stitches between the circles on both the upper and lower edges of the bodice back. And again, just make sure to leave yourself long tails for pulling up those bobbin threads. Okay, now you're going to start to pull up your bobbin threads, and just like the last one, you can just kind of roughly put some gathers in for now. You don't really know how many you need until you go to pin it to the waistband piece and to the yoke piece. So for now, just kind of get some gathers in there. Don't go crazy because you don't want to have to pull them out later. So what we're doing here is just roughly putting in some gathers, and then we'll adjust when we attach the waistband. Okay, and then there you have your bodice back piece with gathers along the upper and lower edge. Okay, so now we're going to pin our waistbands to our bodice fronts. Now you need to be really careful here because the two front waistbands are different from each other for left and right bodice fronts. So make sure you've got the correct one. Now we've already pinned the right side, and now we're going to go ahead and pin the left side, the left waistband to the left bodice front. And what you want to do is match the edges and then match the gathering circle marks and then pull up your gathers to match. And this was what I was talking about in the last chapter, that once you have those circle marks matched, then you can go in and adjust the gathers and make them perfect. And then you're going to sew these seams. So sew the waistbands to the bodice fronts at 5/8 of an inch. You can sew with your gathers on top. That will kind of help you keep an eye on them and make sure they stay nice and straight and behave. And so you're stitching at 5/8 of an inch, and repeat the same thing on the other bodice front. And once they're sewn on, then you can press the seam allowances down towards the waistband. Just want to trim the seam allowances a little bit. Here we're grading the seam allowances, so the bodice waistband is being trimmed to about 1/4 inch, and then the waistband seam allowance will be slightly wider, so about 3/8 of an inch. And that helps to avoid a ridge showing on the right side of the waistband from two seam allowances right on top of each other. So repeat that grading process on both front waistbands. Okay, so now we're going to repeat that for the back waistband. So we've already pinned our waistband to the bodice back and adjusted the gathers, and now stitching at 5/8 again. And then same thing with the waistband fronts. You're going to grade the seam allowances, meaning that the bodice seam allowance is going to be a little bit shorter than the waistband seam allowance. So trim the bodice seam allowance to about 1/4 inch, and then the waistband seam allowance to about 3/8 of an inch, and then press towards the waistband. And then your back waistband is attached. Now we're going to attach one of the yokes to the upper edge of the bodice back. So you've cut 2 yokes, and grab one of them and put it right sides together with the bodice back, adjust those gathers, and then stitch at 5/8 of an inch, back stitching at each end. And then we're going to sew the second yoke you've cut out in the next step. Okay, so now you're going to grab your inner back yoke and you are going to pin it at the bodice seam, that upper edge where you just sewed the first yoke. And what you're going to do is you're going to pin it right sides together with the wrong side of the bodice back. So effectively what you're doing is you are sandwiching the bodice back between the 2 yokes. So this is what it should look like. And this is going to create a really clean finish on the inside of the garment. And now you're going to stitch again at 5/8 of an inch, back stitching at each end. Okay, now you can give it a press flat first. And then if you turn both yokes up, you'll see that the seam allowances are enclosed. Both yokes will get pressed up. And now you'll want to grade these seam allowances just so they don't get too bulky in there. Now we have 3 seam allowances. And the rule is always that the outermost seam allowance, or the one that's closest to the outside of the garment, should always be the longest one or the widest one. So the inner yoke will be the shortest, the outer yoke will be the longest, and then you will trim the bodice back to somewhere in between those 2. And then press again. Now we're going to sew the pant front pockets. These are applied patch pockets with a slanted upper edge. So what you're going to do is apply stay tape, that fusible tape, to the slanted edge of your pocket and press in 5/8 of an inch and then hem it at 1/2 inch. And now you're going to turn in the long vertical edge and the bottom edge 5/8 of an inch and press in. The short vertical edge and the upper edge will get basted into the pant seam allowances, so don't turn those in. Okay, so now you're going to grab one of your pant fronts, and you have placement marks for this, just like we did on the bodice pockets. The lower edge will match that circle mark, and then the raw edges of the pocket will align with the raw edge of the pant side seam, and same at the top. And now, after you've pinned it in place, what we're going to do is you're going to want to baste the short upper edge and the side edge. So we're starting with the side here, and then we'll finish with the upper edge. But what you're going to do is you're going to start where those raw seam allowances are together. You are going to baste the layers together. So use a longer stitch here and stitch it about 1/2 inch. Doesn't really matter as long as it's in the seam allowance. And then when you get to the lower edge of the pocket, you want to make sure you're at your regular 2.5 stitch length. Pivot, and now you're edge stitching. So this will be visible stitching to attach the pocket, pivoting at that corner, stitching the long vertical edge. And then when you get to that short upper edge, you're going to pivot and then baste again. Okay, so there is one pocket attached. You're going to do the same thing on the other pant front. Okay, so now we're going to do gathering stitches at the upper edge of each pant front. So you have circles there, just like you did on the bodice. And you are going to do 2 rows of gathering stitches between those circles. And it's going to go over the top edge of the pocket where it's basted in place. And then you'll be ready to pull those bobbin threads up later. Now we're going to do the back pant pockets. So we've applied stay tape to the upper edge, just like we like to do anywhere we have an upper hemmed edge of a pocket. And one of our pockets is already pressed in, but what you're going to do on the other one is you are going to press in 5/8 of an inch along that upper edge of the pocket. And then, just like we've done on the other pockets for this garment, we have so many pockets on this jumpsuit, you are going to hem at 1/2 inch. And then you're going to turn in the remaining edges of your pocket 5/8 of an inch and press. Okay, now we're going to sew the pockets to the pant back. And there's one finished one. And then on that one pocket that we've only hemmed, here you can see turning in the remaining edges of the pocket and pressing in 5/8 of an inch so that it's ready to be edge stitched to the pant back. You can see this has a shape like a jean pocket with that angled lower edge. So just make sure you get a clean point at the bottom of the pocket. And then grab your pant back and place it right side up. You should have your circles marked. And then you're going to pin the pocket to the pant back. And just like the other pockets we've done, the other patch pockets, you're going to leave that hemmed edge free and edge stitch around the other edges. And this is similar to how we did the patch pocket on the bodice. So we're gonna do some little triangles for extra reinforcement. So starting at the hem stitching on the upper edge, you're going to stitch diagonally up towards the fold of the upper edge of the pocket, and then pivot, do a couple stitches across the top until you get to the fold, pivot again, and then continue down that long vertical edge. So that's a reinforcement technique. It gives you a little triangle at each upper edge that looks really kind of cute. And you don't have to be too precise about it. You can just eyeball it like we did here. And here's our second one. And there you go. That is your applied back patch pocket. So give it a nice press and then you're good to go. Now we're going to sew the back crotch curve. So put your two pant backs right sides together and match them along that J-shaped crotch curve. And then you're going to stitch at 5/8 of an inch. And we're stitching from the waist to the crotch point. Make sure you backstitch at each end here. And now you can trim your seam allowances as one. So we've already serged our seam allowances and trimmed them down to 3/8 of an inch. And now what you're going to do is press them to one side. So press the seam allowances to the right side as you're looking at the wrong side of the pant back. And the next thing we're going to do is top stitch this seam. So you're going to stitch 1/8 of an inch to either side of this seam line. So the seam allowances will be pressed underneath one side only, but you are going to top stitch to either side of the seam line. And this is going to provide a lot of reinforcement in this high stress area of a garment. And it's also going to be a decorative detail. Workwear usually has a lot of top stitching on it, so we want to continue that aesthetic and also make sure that it matches other parts of the garment. So you're going to be top stitching on both sides, 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line. And there's your back crotch curve sewn. Now we're going to attach each bodice front to each pant front. So here's one side already done. Now we're going to do the other side. So you can see it's already pinned. What you're going to do is you're going to take that pant front and attach it to the waistband, pin right sides together, and then you're going to distribute the gathers. So it's not a lot of gathers here, you might want to note. And there really aren't gathers on top of the pocket. So you're kind of gathering to either side of where you basted that upper edge of the pocket. And now you're going to press those seam allowances towards the waistband, just like we did when we attached the bodice to the waistband. And then you can press from the inside, and I bet you know what we're going to do next, which is we're going to grade those seam allowances, just like we did for the bodice waistband seam. And you're going to trim the pant seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch, and then the waistband seam allowance down to about 3/8 of an inch. And now you have a full front unit with the bodice and the pant both attached to the waistband. And just make sure that those seam allowances stay pressed towards the waistband. And here are both sides of our jumpsuit front. And now we're going to attach the bodice back waistband unit to the pants back unit. So you're going to put the bodice right sides together with the pant back at the raw edge. So you're matching the pant back to the waistband back. And there are no gathers on the pant back, so you just have two flat pieces of fabric that you're pinning to each other. But making sure that you're matching those notches. And now you're going to sew at 5/8 of an inch. And now yet again, we are going to grade our seam allowances and press towards the waistband. So your waistband will be the longer seam allowance and the pant back will be the shorter one. So grade those seam allowances and then press the seam allowances towards the waistband. And there is your completed jumpsuit back. Now we're going to assemble the waist tabs. So these are a really nice vintage detail and they help you adjust the cinchiness of your waist if desired. So you have two sets of waist tabs. Two of them are interfaced and two of them are uninterfaced. So you're going to pin them together in pairs, one interfaced to one non-interfaced waist tab. Pin them right sides together around all the edges except for the short straight one. And now we're stitching at 5/8 of an inch around the two long edges and that angled short end. And now you can grade your seam allowances. The uninterfaced one should be the shorter one. So a rule of thumb is that if you have two layers of a garment area, like a collar or a tab like this, the interfaced one is going to be the outermost layer when worn. So now you're going to turn those right side out. It's a tiny little kind of tube to turn right side out. So you'll probably want to have a tool on hand, like a knitting needle, a chopstick, a point presser like we have here. And poke that angled end out. And you want to keep tabs on where the interfaced layer is, because now we're going to press it and you want to press it in a way so that the seam line just slightly rolls into the non-interfaced layer of the tab. So the side that's going to be hidden. So you want to kind of hide the seam line there. So you can kind of manipulate that seam line with your fingers as you press. And now we're going to top stitch, or really edge stitch, at 1/8 of an inch around all those sides that we sewed. And there's your finished waist tabs. Okay, so now we're going to attach our tabs to the jumpsuit back. So you can see that the buttonholes on the waist tabs were sewn off camera, so you want to go ahead and do that before you attach it, because it's easiest to make buttonholes on these small pieces before it gets attached to the jumpsuit. And then with the right side of the tab facing the right side of the jumpsuit back, you're going to place it on the waistband and baste in place. And you can backstitch on this basting just to help secure it a little bit better. And make sure that your seam allowances on the waistband stay pressed towards the waistband. And there you have your tabs attached to your jumpsuit back. Now we're ready to attach our front facings. So you can see we've already applied this 1-inch square fusible interfacing over the lower circle on the jumpsuit, left front. And then pin the left front interfacing together, right sides together with the jumpsuit. And now you're going to stitch at 5/8 of an inch from the neckline all the way down. Make sure your seam allowances stay pressed where they're supposed to at the waistband. And then ending just at that circle mark. And now there's a diagonal clip line marked on the pattern. You want to cut exactly on that clip line to the circle. And now we're going to grade our seam allowances. Now this is a little tricky because we have a break point for the lapel. That's where the lapel flips to the outside of the garment. And so you have to reverse the grading rule at the break point. So the seam allowances below the break point, the jumpsuit will be wider and the facing is narrower, and then the opposite is true above the break point. And now make sure that you do some little notches around the curve. And then you also want to do a notch right at the break point. Now you're going to flip the facing to the inside of the garment and you're going to press it. And below the lapel point, you're going to just roll that seam line to the inside of the garment. And then above the break point, the opposite is true. So you're going to roll the seam line to the outside of the garment. Now we're going to apply the right front facing. So you're going to apply that square fusible interfacing just below the crotch curve circle, and then pin the facing to the jumpsuit front, making sure that you're matching any notches. And you want to make sure that your zipper line is marked on the right side of the facing. And now you're going to stitch from the neckline all the way down to the bottom edge of the facing on this side. And so just stitch to the lower edge and back stitch there. And now you're going to grade again. So you can first clip into your seam allowances just below the facing. So do a clip right to the seam line. And now we're going to grade our seam allowances. And below the lapel point, again, you're going to do the same thing. So the facing should be the shorter seam allowance, and the jumpsuit should be the wider one. And then just reverse that above the lapel point so that the jumpsuit is the shorter seam allowance and the interfaced facing is the longer one. So I know that's a little confusing, but you can always refer to your instructions there to make sure you're grading in the correct direction. Okay, now we are going to sew the overlap side of the zipper. So you're working on the right side of the jumpsuit front that we just sewed the facing to, and you're going to press the facing away from the garment, and the seam allowances get pressed towards the garment itself. And then you're going to take your zipper and you're going to place it face down over that marked zipper line on the right side of your facing, making sure that the bottom stop is positioned right on top of the circle and that the zipper teeth are right on top of that marked line. And then you are going to pin to the right side of the tape all the way down. So make sure that your zipper is wrong side facing down here. Very important. And now you can open the zipper a little bit and you're going to use a zipper foot to stitch close to the teeth, as close as you can without stitching on the teeth, from top to bottom of the zipper, and backstitch at the top and bottom stop. And that is the overlap side of your zipper sewn. Okay, so now we're going to sew the underlap side of the zipper. And so what we're looking at here is the right side that you just sewed, and it's going to overlap the left side like so. So it's going to form this fly front. So you're going to have your left side of your jumpsuit on a flat surface, and it's helpful to put a ruler or something underneath so you can pin through the layers. And you should have a few marked lines here. Ours are really faint, but you're going to have a center front line and a zipper marked line. And then your circles should be on the right side. And now you're going to take your right front, fold in the facing, and you're going to overlap it over the left front so that it matches the center front line that is marked in. Make sure that your waistline, your waistband seams match. And now you can lift up the right side, exposing the zipper underneath. And now you're going to pin through the zipper tape to the left jumpsuit front underneath, pinning all the way up the zipper tape. And at the top of the zipper, you can fold in the upper edge of the zipper tape if you like. Some people leave it this unfolded at the top, but we chose to fold ours and then top stitch it down. And then just place another pin there, and then we'll be ready to stitch this. And now we're going to sew the underlap side of the zipper tape. So bring your garment to the machine. So both sides are attached now. And you're going to start stitching that pinned zipper tape from the top with that folded under edge. Just kind of position everything, get your needle down, and then open the zipper. And you're stitching close to the teeth using your zipper foot from the top all the way to the bottom of the zipper. And there you can see it's stitched in place, and the stitching goes through the facing as well. And next we'll be ready to sew our pant fronts together. Okay, so now we are going to sew our pant front crotch curve. So you're going to fold this right sides together and match the raw edges of the crotch curve. Now you can see we're sewing the romper version, so that we can fit it all on the ironing board for you here. Okay, so you're going to pin this crotch curve, and you're pinning from the point where you clipped into the seam allowances when you sewed the facing down to the crotch point. So stitch it 5/8 of an inch and backstitch on both ends, ending at that clip point. And now you want to finish those seam allowances as one and trim to 3/8 of an inch. Okay, so it's serged here, you can see that, and now you're going to press those seam allowances as one to the right as you're looking at it from the wrong side. Okay, so we are pressing that seam allowance to the right, but unlike the back crotch curve, we are not going to top stitch it yet. Okay, so just press it to the right, and then in a later step, we will be doing the top stitching, but we have to do all of the fly front top stitching first. So just leave it pressed to one side, and then we will move on to the next step. Okay, so in this step, we are going to be doing the top stitching for the fly front, and that is called a J curve because the stitching on a fly front looks like a J. So you're going to want to make sure that that J curve line is transferred to the right side of your jumpsuit right front. And so what we're doing here is just making sure that that line is marked in. Now you can use your right front facing piece as a template to draw in your J curve, but just make sure that it's very accurately marked here. That's the most important thing. And then from the wrong side, you're going to want to grab that left front facing at the underlap here and pin it out of the way at the base of the zipper, because you don't want to stitch through that layer with your J curve top stitching. Okay, and you can also see that we've placed a pin at the base of our zipper. And you want to make sure that the bottom stop of your zipper is out of the way of where your marked stitching line is. And now you're going to pin through that marked J curve line from top to bottom, making sure all of your layers are flat, making sure that underlap facing is out of the way. And now, just double check that there. And then you'll take it to the machine and top stitch along your J curve line. Okay, so starting at the top of the marked J curve line, you're going to top stitch, make sure to back stitch. And this is visible stitching, so take your time, you've got this. Stitch all the way down, following the curve of the marked line. And back stitching at the base. And you just want to make sure that you didn't catch the other facing in your stitching. And if it looks good, you can release those pins. And hopefully you're happy with your J curve stitching. And if you are, you can give it a nice press. And there is your fly front. Now we're going to bar tack the J curve to secure these layers together. So make sure that the underlap facing is turned correctly flat, and then you're going to place a pin just above the curve of the J curve. And now we're going to do a bar tack through all the layers. So you're doing a small short zigzag and then stitching for about 1/4 inch, stitching through all the layers to create a tack that will secure them in place. Okay, so now we're ready to top stitch the front crotch curve. So from the wrong side, just make sure that those seam allowances are pressed towards the right. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to stitch on both sides of the seam line. But for a fly front like this, you're going to top stitch all the way up to this mark, this circle mark that's slightly above the base of the zipper, because you want to close off this little hole, this opening at the base of the fly zipper. So we're going to stitch up to the circle mark, and then we are going to pivot twice and then return. So here you can watch it. We're stitching an 1/8 of an inch away to the right of the seam line, and then continuing up past the base of the zipper, the fly front, and then pivoting at that mark, stitching to 1/8 of an inch past the seam line, pivoting again, and then continuing so that we're edge stitching down the other side of that crotch curve. And so now the base of the fly is closed up and all the seam allowances are held flat here, which is what you want. Okay, so now we are going to do another bar tack that is at that point where you pivoted your top stitching for the crotch curve. So set your machine to that narrow zigzag with a very short stitch length, and you're going to do a horizontal bar tack across that point where we marked and where you pivoted your top stitching on the crotch curve. Okay, so you're just going to bar tack to reinforce that point there because it does get a lot of wear at the base of the zipper. So now you have 2 bar tacks on your crotch and you're ready to go. Okay, so now we are ready to sew our collar. You have 2 collar pieces. One is interfaced and the other one is not. You're going to put them right sides together and pin around the 2 short ends and the long unnotched end, and then sew 5/8 of an inch pivoting at those corners. And now you're going to clip across those corners to reduce bulk. And now we're going to grade. So the uninterfaced one will be the shorter seam allowance, and the interfaced one will be the wider one. So remember what we talked about earlier, if you have an interfaced layer, that one is always going to be, almost always going to be the upper layer. So the interfaced side will be the upper layer of the collar. Now you're going to turn this right side out, press those corners out. You can use a point turner to press them out gently, push them out gently. And now press from the wrong side, rolling the seam line so that it's hidden on the underside of the collar. And now you've got these raw edges here, you've got notches. You're going to stitch from one end of the collar to the first notch, and then from the next notch to the other end of the collar, leaving open in between the notches. Now grab your scissors and clip all the way to the seam line at the notches. And that will allow you to turn in the seam allowance of the upper side of the collar, the interface side, 5/8 of an inch, and press. But you're going to leave the other seam allowance unpressed. Okay, so now we're going to sew the shoulder seams on our jumpsuit. So you're going to grab the front jumpsuit and the outer yoke and just sew, pin and sew those 2 together at the shoulder seams. So match your notches. So just note that you're leaving the inner yoke free of your pinning and stitching on these steps. So now we will stitch at 5/8 of an inch and backstitch on each end. And now you're going to press the seam allowances towards the yoke. And now, a big warning here, you're going to see Kristen grade the seam allowances here, but you should not do this, okay? Kristen has warned us she should not have done this here. So just ignore the grading. You're just going to press these seam allowances for now, and we'll explain why in the next step. Okay, so now we are going to sew that inner yoke seam. Now, this is why you didn't want to grade in the last step, because you're going to want to match those raw edges. But if you've trimmed the seam allowances, then you won't have the raw edges to match. But Kristen already graded hers, so she just marked in the seam line on the inner yoke so that she could match the seam lines. But if you didn't grade already, then you won't have to worry about that. You will just match the raw edges. So what you're going to do is you're going to flip this. So you want the right side of the inner yoke to match the wrong side of the bodice. And now you're going to pin those together. So wrong side of inner yoke facing the right side of the jumpsuit front is what it actually is. And now we are stitching. And that's going to get us a clean finish when we flip it right side out. So you can just do a test flip there and make sure that everything is correctly oriented. And if it is, then you can turn it wrong side back out and trim those seam allowances. So now you can go back and trim the seam allowances. And then flip it back right side out and press. So all the seam allowances will be going towards the bodice back, and you have this nice clean finish at the shoulder seam. Okay, so now we're going to stay stitch our neckline. We're going to do the facings and the neckline in 2 separate steps. So for this first part, you can exclude the front facings and just stitch around the front and back necklines at 1/2 inch. And the 2 back yoke layers will be stitched as one, just a note. And now you can clip into those curves. This is going to help us stitch our collar on in an upcoming step. So about every 1/2 inch, clip into your curves. And now you can stay stitch the neckline of the front facings as well. So just around those curves, the neckline curves on the front facings. And clip into those curves every 1/2 inch, just like we did on the neckline. And next we'll move on to attaching the collar. Okay, so now we're ready to attach our collar. You can keep those front facings free. And you're going to grab your collar, and the uninterfaced side will match the bodice. You can start at the center back neckline. You're going to match your shoulder seams to the notches on the collar. And then the finished edge of the collar should match your circle mark on your bodice fronts. Now, very important to note about the collar, if things are not matching up, you should go back and check your pattern pieces. This collar is asymmetrical, just like we had an asymmetrical front bodice piece and front waistband pieces because of that overlap for the front fly closure. So if things aren't matching up, that means you may have inadvertently flipped your collar over and are sewing it upside down, which means that the notches wouldn't be matching. So keep an eye on that. If you do see that things aren't matching, just make sure to go back and check those pattern pieces. Okay, so now we are going to stitch the collar on at 5/8 of an inch. And we're stitching from the bodice side, making sure that your clips are spreading to accommodate the collar, and then back stitching at those circle marks. So there's your collar sewn on. And in the next steps, we'll move on to sewing those facings in place. Okay, so now we're ready to stitch the front facings in place. So you can see what we've done here is turned the facing to the right side, turn in that little shoulder seam, that straight shoulder seam, press it in 5/8 of an inch and match it up to the shoulder seam where you folded it. And so you're sandwiching the garment, or really the collar, in between the facing and the jumpsuit front. And now you can stitch. So starting at center front, and we're working from the jumpsuit side here, and just keep an eye on your seams, just making sure that you don't get any little tucks or anything like that. And then stitching to that fold on the shoulder seam of the facing. Do that on both sides. And now you can clip away the seam allowance at that center front corner. And you can trim down all of these seam allowances around the neckline as much as you want. If you have a bulky fabric, you may want to grade these down. And now we're going to turn the facing right side out and poke out those corners. And we're going to want to make some clips here. So grab your scissors and then clip through the seam allowances at the point where it's notched, where the collar opens out with that turned in seam allowance. And what's going to happen is you're going to be pressing those neckline seam allowances up, and they're going to get completely enclosed between the collar layers. And this will get pressed flat here to give a really nice crisp lapel, because this will be turned out on the right side of your jumpsuit. So you want it to look nice and crisp. And another thing you can do here is to clip into these seam allowances in that facing area so that you can just release any tension there and you're not seeing any pulling or puckering like that, to really help aid you in getting that nice flat professional looking lapel. I'm going to press all that flat, clipping on the other side here. And what's going to happen next is that you are going to slip stitch. So there's some hand stitching that's going to happen here that we're going to do off camera. But first you're going to pin. So that little short shoulder seam on the facing will get pinned and stitched to the shoulder seam of the garment. And that back collar layer, so the upper collar layer really, that's turned in and is loose now, will get pinned in place, enclosing the seam allowances of the neckline. Pin it in place, and then you will slip stitch. Okay, now we're ready to sew the side seam and the inseam of the jumpsuit. You can see the nicely finished neckline and shoulder seams there. Now we're going to put the jumpsuit right sides together. It's only attached to the shoulders at this point, so we want to stitch those side seams and the inseam. So start by matching the waistband seams and make sure that the seam allowances stay pressed towards the waistband. And you're going to pin from the underarm down to the bottom of the pant, or you can see we're doing the shorts version, the Playsuit version. So we did that strategically for this video, so we didn't have real long pieces here that you couldn't really see on camera. So we're going to be stitching something really short, but if you're making the pant version, you're going to have a much longer seam to sew here. And same with the inseam. For a Playsuit like this, you just have this real short little inseam. But obviously for a long pant, you would have a much longer seam to sew here. You're going to start by matching the crotch seam. Now we've designed this so that those seam allowances are staggered, meaning they're pressed in two different directions. That's going to help with bulk here. So just make sure they stay pressed that way. And then we're pinning the opposite side seam, again matching those waistband seams. And then the next step will be to sew these seams at 5/8 of an inch. So nice easy seams here, each side seam and then that inseam. All right, now we have some pressing to do. You can see using a ham can help you in an area like this little inseam here. Just raise that seam so that you can really isolate it. So press those seam allowances open for both the inseam and the side seams. And after that, we're going to move on to some sleeve examples. So next will be the short puff sleeve. We're also going to sew the long sleeve on camera today. So if you're doing the long sleeve, you may want to skip forward to that step. But if you're doing the puff sleeve, we will be working on that next. All right, so we're going to sew the short puff sleeve first. Like I said, we're going to do the long sleeve next, so you can skip forward if you just want to see the long sleeve. So on the short sleeve, you're going to put those underarm seams right sides together and pin. And now we're going to stitch at 5/8 of an inch and press open. Okay, now we're going to do our gathering stitches on these short sleeves. So this sleeve style has gathering at the sleeve cap where it meets the bodice and also at the sleeve hem where it meets the sleeve band. So the first thing you're going to do is on the sleeve cap, you are going to do 2 rows of gathering stitches between your circles. And just like we did for the bodice gathering, 1 at 1/2 inch and 1 at 1/4 inch, leaving long tails on both ends. And then at the hem, you're going to do it starting and ending an inch away from that underarm seam. And now you can start to create those gathers, pulling up the bobbin threads. And as usual, you don't have to do a ton here because we will distribute them very evenly when we sew it into the bodice and sew it to the band. So don't worry too much about getting it the exact right size, the exact amount of gathers that you need. Just sort of get it started and then we will distribute in the next step. Okay, so now we are going to sew the sleeve band. You can see we've already prepped one here, and now we'll do those steps on this other one. So both sleeve bands should be interfaced, and then you're going to press it in half lengthwise with the wrong sides together. Now you're just pressing it to crease for now, and then you're going to turn in the seam allowance on one long edge and press. And now you can open out both of those creases that you just pressed, and fold this into a ring, right sides together, and pin and stitch along the short edges. So you're stitching at 5/8 of an inch, and then you're going to press this open. Okay, so here's one band already sewn to a sleeve. So this is what we're going to be doing. And on this one, we've already pinned that band to the sleeve, the lower edge, right sides together, and distributed the gathers evenly all the way around. And now you're going to sew around this ring at 5/8 of an inch. And very important that you match those underarm seams. So the seam allowances should be matching. There are notches to match. So just spend some time pinning, and then you're going to stitch at 5/8 of an inch. And now we're going to grade our seam allowances. So the garment itself, the sleeve, should be the narrower one, and the cuff or the band should be the wider seam allowance. So take a little time to grade those, get rid of that bulk. And now turn the sleeve right side out. And we're going to press those seam allowances down towards the band. So now we're working from the wrong side again. And you're going to turn up that seam allowance that you creased. So turn it back in and then flip it along the crease line down the center of the band. And so you're going to turn this in and pin it. You want that folded edge of the inner band to be just covering the seam line where the band meets the sleeve. Because what we're going to do next is stitch in the ditch. So that means we're going to be stitching right in the seam line where the band meets the sleeve, and you want to make sure that you're going to catch the inner band inside. So pin all the way around, pinning right at the seam line, making sure that you are catching that folded in edge of the band. You can also hand stitch this if you like, if that feels easier. Stitching in the ditch is fast, but it also is a little bit fiddly to make sure that everything's pinned correctly and that you're catching that inner band as you stitch. So you are just stitching right in the ditch of the seam line, taking it slow, and you want to make sure that you've caught the band on the inside. And now you're going to press it flat. You can see some little ripples around the edge there, but just give it a nice press and it will look great. Okay, now we're ready to set these sleeves into the bodice. So we've already done one side, now we're going to do the next. So grab your short sleeve and you're going to start by matching the underarm seams right sides together, sleeve to bodice. And then you're going to match your notches. There'll be a single notch in the front and a double notch in the back of the sleeve. If that is not matching up, then you've got the wrong sleeve and the wrong armhole, so just switch them. Try again. And so once you've filled in pins from each set of notches around the underarm, now you're going to need to distribute those gathers around the sleeve cap. So you can start by matching, there's a notch that matches the shoulder seam at the sleeve cap. So pin there, and then you can pull up the gathers more until the sleeve matches the bodice. And you also have those gathering circles to help guide you. And now you're going to stitch. So I usually start at the underarm seam when setting a sleeve, and you're going to stitch all the way around. Anytime you have gathers like this, it is helpful to stitch from the gathered side. Just make sure that all those gathers stay in place. It can kind of reduce the amount of correcting you have to do later, if any. And then you're going to trim down your seam allowances and finish them as one. So if you're doing a serger, just trim and serge at the same time, trimming all the seam allowances as one down to about 3/8 of an inch. And now you just want to press these seams. So you press the seam allowances towards the sleeve. And a ham is really helpful here, just to isolate that seam and get it raised. And that will be it for your puff sleeve. Next, we're going to move on to the long sleeve. And if you don't want to see the long sleeve, you can skip forward to chapter 48 now. Now we're going to sew the long sleeve placket. This is called a continuous bound placket. So you have a little binding piece for the placket. You're going to fold it in half, right sides together, lengthwise, and crease, and then press in each long edge so that the raw edge meets the crease. So basically forming a little bit of bias binding here, and then press it flat. Like so. And now you're going to grab your sleeve, your long sleeve, and you have a line marked in for the placket with a circle at the end. And now you're going to stitch around that line 1/8 of an inch to either side of the line and pivot at the top to reinforce it. And now slash down the marked line, ending just before your stitching you just did. And now we're going to bind this. So working right sides together, you are going to you're going to open out your binding and pin the raw edges together. So the center of the placket, of the binding, should meet your circle mark here. And this confuses a lot of people. We're going to, but we're going to take it step by step. So you're going to stitch on one side and then the other side, like so. Now what's going to happen is that you're stitching right along that first crease line. When you get to the center point of the placket, your edges of the binding and the placket opening aren't going to match exactly, okay? So keep that in mind because you slashed all the way to that circle. So there's one side done. Now you're going to flip this to the inside. Flip the binding to the inside so that it encloses the seam allowances of the slash. And now you're going to pin the binding closed again. And then we will stitch the binding, we'll edge stitch it so that it's completely finished. And you can just do that in a straight line, stitching the fold of the inner side of the placket down. There you've got a nice bound placket. Now you're going to fold it together from the inside, from the wrong side. And now you're going to sew a little diagonal line of stitching across the upper edge. You just eyeball it, that's to hold it in place. And now what we're going to do is press both sides of the binding towards the sleeve front. So one will be pressed flat and the other one will be pressed in. But both sides of that binding should be oriented towards the front of the sleeve. Press it flat and there is your binding. Now we're ready to sew the underarm seam on the sleeve. So pin it right sides together. And then you're going to take it to your machine and stitch at 5/8 of an inch and then press that seam allowance open. Now we're going to sew the sleeve cuff. So you have one interfaced and one that is not interfaced. Now just carefully note the notches on the sleeve cuff because you have one notch up there. There's an underlap situation on this cuff, so we'll talk through it here. So what we're going to do is sew from that notch around the short end and then finish at the other short end. So I'm starting at that notch, back stitching, pivoting, short end, then the long end, and then finally the short end, and that's where you finish. Okay, so now you're going to clip to that notch all the way to the seam line, grade your seam allowances so that the uninterfaced cuff is the shorter or narrower seam allowance. Trim those corners away. And now you're going to turn in the uninterfaced seam allowance at the top, 5/8 of an inch, and press. And then turn it right sides out. You can use your point presser here to get nice crisp corners on the extension side. And so now you'll press it flat, and you can see what I was talking about here, that there's an extension on one end, but not the other. Okay, so now we're going to sew this cuff to the sleeve. So you're going to start on the back side of the binding at the placket. So the binding is pressed flat here on the back and it meets the extension like so. And so pin it together there. So just remember that that binding is not folded in on itself. It's pressed flat for the back. And then match your notches to the underarm seam. And then at the front side, the binding is pressed in on itself and it meets the very end of the cuff. So it should be flush with the end of the cuff. And now we're going to stitch this, making sure that turned inside of the cuff is staying free. And now you'll just grade your seam allowances so that the sleeve is shorter or narrower and the cuff is wider. Okay, now we're ready to finish the cuff. So what you're going to do is you're going to turn those seam allowances towards the cuff itself so that they are enclosed between the cuff layers. And then you'll want to pin that in place and press as you go. So just get those seam allowances exactly as you want them, pinned in between the layers of the cuff, and place pins all the way around, and then you're going to edge stitch all the way around the cuff. So around all four sides of it, about 1/8 of an inch away from the fold. And then after you do that, your next steps with this sleeve are going to be to set it into the bodice. So you can refer to your instructions for that. It's the same as easing in any sleeve cap into a bodice. And we also show you how to do it with the puff sleeve in an earlier chapter if you want to refer to that as well. But that is your long sleeve, and next we'll be ready to move on to lining the waistband. Okay, now we're going to prepare our waistband lining. This is a step that's going to make your garment look really nice and clean finished on the inside. Now you're going to have two separate lining pieces for your left front and your right front of the waistband, so keep that in mind. And you're going to pin them together with the back lining at the side seams. So pin those short edges together, and then you're going to stitch at 5/8 of an inch and press those seam allowances open. And then finally, you're going to press in the long edges of this waistband lining unit 1/2 an inch on both the upper edge and the lower edge, okay? So remember, it's 1/2 an inch, not 5/8 of an inch here, like we would normally do. So that's 1/2 an inch on both long edges of this piece. And then next we'll move on to attaching it to the inside of the jumpsuit. Okay, so now we're going to attach the waistband lining to the left side of the facing. So the right side of the facing is already stitched down from that J-curve top stitching, but the left side is still free. So you want to press in one short end, the right side of the facing, make sure it's the right side. Press that short end in, and then the unpressed side will meet the left side facing between the notches. And then you're going to pin these two together, right sides together, and stitch at 5/8 of an inch. So again, remember the left and right sides of this waistband lining are asymmetrical. So if things aren't matching, make sure that you didn't mix up the left and right sides. Okay, so now that is stitched in place, and you can press the waistband lining away from the facing. So pressing it over the seam allowances like this. And now you'll see it's all prepped to clean finish the inside of the garment here. And next we'll talk about attaching it on the inside. Okay, so now we're going to pin the waistband lining in place and stitch it in place from the right side. It's going to be a stitch in the ditch situation. So you have marks to match up to your side seams, and this takes a little while and it's a little fussy. It's the only way to do it at this point. It's going to take you a little time because you need to pin from the right side. Okay, so you need to make sure that the folded edge of the waistband lining is now caught in your pins because we're going to stitch in the ditch from the right side. Okay, so this definitely takes a little while and you have to kind of keep going back and checking the inside of the garment to make sure that you are catching that fold as you're pinning from the right side. So this is definitely a time-consuming step. Just take your time with it because it is going to give you a really beautiful finish on the inside of your jumpsuit. Now, the other option is you could hand stitch this in place. So if you're one of those people who loves to hand stitch things, that would definitely be an option here. But we're going to machine stitch it to show you that it is possible. Just keep pinning from the right side, making sure that you're catching the waistband lining from the inside. And then when you get to the right front, you want to be really careful of the zipper here because you don't want to stitch over our metal zipper. Okay, so we're at the right front here. And you're just gonna make sure to give yourself a mark or a pin or something so that you don't accidentally stitch over your zipper teeth. So you wanna stop stitching short of the zipper teeth. Okay, so once you're satisfied with your pinning, I know that was a lot, but I'm sure you did a great job. We're going to stitch this in place from the right side. So stitching all the way around the waistline and catching the lining in place. Okay, so we're stitching from the right side and you're stitching right in the ditch, removing your pins as you go. And be careful for those waist tabs. You don't want to catch those in your stitching, so just keep them out of the way. Okay, and you're going to end just shy of those zipper teeth. And then you're going to repeat that whole stitch in the ditch process on the other edge of the waistband, the other side of the waistband. Okay, so repeat that process and then your waistband lining will be complete. Okay, so let's talk buttons for this back waistband for the tabs. So there are markings on the waistband where you would place 2 buttons on each side. The idea is that this is adjustable. So You can use our markings, or if you want to try on the jumpsuit at this point and see if you want to move the inner button marking closer to center back just to get more cinching, that would be fine. But just see what you want to do. You may want to customize it for yourself, but you're going to sew 2 buttons on each side, and then don't forget to sew buttons to the long sleeve cuff as well as if you did the long sleeves. Okay, so now we are on to our last step, which is hemming. So for the shorts version and the pant version without a cuff, what you're going to do is turn up the hem 5/8 of an inch, press it, and then top stitch at 1/2 inch. Now, if you want to do the pant with a cuff, refer to the instructions because there are instructions for doing that really cool vintage style cuff on the long pant. Okay, so here we are top stitching at 1/2 inch on this shorts version. You're going to do that on both legs, and then you'll want to press, whichever hem you do, you want to press it flat. It's a good idea for all of these steps to just give it a final press just so that your finished garment looks beautiful, which I'm sure it does. Okay, everyone, that is it, your Rosie jumpsuit. I hope you've loved learning how to sew this today and that you've picked up a lot of new skills. I can't wait to see what you make with it, so please do tag me in your makes and also use the hashtag #CharmPatterns. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.